My name is Claire, and what I am about to share with you is not just a story. It is the night everything I thought I knew about family was ripped apart. I remember the moment like it was burned into my memory. The air was heavy, my palms were sweating, and my chest felt like it was collapsing. You see, betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people you trust most, the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. That evening, I walked into the living room expecting laughter, warmth, and the comfort of family. Instead, I was met with silence so sharp it could cut glass. Every eye turned toward me not with kindness, but with judgment. My sister's words came like a blade. "You don't belong here, Claire. This isn't your place." It was as if the floor beneath me had cracked open. I had always known I was treated differently, but hearing it out loud in front of everyone felt like my soul had been stripped bare. I wish I could say I stood tall in that moment, but the truth, my voice cracked, my legs trembled. I looked at my parents hoping for a sign for anyone to defend me. Instead, my father looked away, and my mother folded her hands in her lap. That silence screamed louder than any insult ever could. When betrayal hits you like that, you can't breathe. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. Why now? Why here? The room felt smaller, suffocating. Their eyes burned into me as if I were an intruder, a stranger who had wandered into a place I had no right to be. But here's the cruel truth. This wasn't sudden. It was the explosion of years of whispers, of cold shoulders, of being treated like an outsider in my own family. Tonight was just the night they decided to say it out loud. And once the words escaped, there was no taking them back. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand answers. But my throat tightened and only silence came out. The humiliation washed over me thick and heavy. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. And in that instant, I realized something. This was no longer about love or family or even belonging. This was about survival. The walls of the house that was supposed to be my home suddenly felt like a prison. Every photograph on the wall mocked me. Every memory I thought we shared felt like a lie. I could see my sister smirk, her confidence growing as the others stayed silent. It wasn't just exclusion. It was domination, a message that I had no power here. That was the moment my chest stopped aching and started burning. Rage, sharp and electric, coursed through me. I knew right then that something inside me had shifted. They thought they had broken me, but what they had really done was light a fire I didn't know I had. Because when someone pushes you out of the world you thought you belonged to, you face a choice: collapse or rise. And I wasn't about to collapse. Not tonight, not ever again. I leaned against the door frame, my voice finally finding its way out, shaky but present. If I don't belong here, then maybe none of this belongs to me either. It wasn't the revenge line I had dreamed of delivering, but it was real and it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I had spoken with my own voice, not the silenced shadow they had forced me to be. And that's where my story begins. The hook was simple, but it had already locked me into the fight of my life. The room was still echoing with my sister's cruel words when I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who has ever felt erased in their own home. And as I stood there, in that suffocating silence, a thought hit me. I wasn't alone in this feeling. Somewhere out there, someone else had been told they didn't belong. Someone else had been silenced by the very voices that should have lifted them up. Before I dive deeper into the storm that unfolded after that night, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like the outsider in your own family? Have you ever looked around a table filled with people you share blood with and thought, why does it feel like I'm the stranger here? If you know that sting, if you've ever lived that silence, then stay with me, because this story isn't just mine, it could just as easily be yours. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join me here. You'll never have to sit through these moments alone again. I was 28 years old at the time, old enough to build my own life, but still tied by invisible chains. to the hope that maybe, just maybe, my family would one day treat me as one of their own. That night crushed that hope into dust. My sister, younger than me by 2 years, had always carried herself like the golden child. Every accomplishment she made was celebrated, every mistake excused. And me, I was the shadow, useful when they needed me, disposable when they didn't. But hearing her spit out the words, "You don't belong here," lit something inside me that wouldn't go out. It was almost poetic in a twisted way. She didn't know that by casting me out, she had freed me. I went back to my apartment that night, driving with tears blurring the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard they ached, but I didn't care. My mind was racing faster than my car. I replayed every look, every smirk, every time my mother had told me to let it go, every time my father had said I was too sensitive. Sensitive, no. I was awake now, and there's a difference. At 2 a.m, I sat on the edge of my bed and realized I had a choice. I could either spend my life chasing their approval, or I could build a world where I didn't need it. The decision was terrifying and liberating. I chose me. But let me tell you, choosing yourself is not the fairy tale moment people make it sound like. It's not standing on a mountain with the sun rising and violins playing in the background. It's messy. It's painful. It's nights of crying until your throat burns. It's looking at old photographs and realizing you were never really included in those smiles. It's mourning people who are still alive. And yet beneath that pain, there's power. Because once you choose yourself, you start to see every small act of resilience as victory. Waking up in the morning and making coffee without shaking. Going to work and not carrying their words like chains. Even laughing, yes, laughing without guilt. Those moments became my rebellion. I didn't know it then, but what I was beginning that night wasn't an ending. It was the start of a new story, one where I was no longer the scapegoat in someone else's narrative. I was going to be the author. So when I look back now, I don't see that night as the moment I lost my family. I see it as the night I finally found myself. And here's what I'll promise you, this story will take you places you don't expect. Because just when I thought I had walked away for good life, had a way of pulling me back into their orbit. And what came next? It changed everything. The morning after that brutal confrontation, I woke up with swollen eyes and a hollow chest. Sunlight poured through my curtains, but it felt like the world outside didn't care that my universe had just cracked in half. I dragged myself into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and stared at the steam rising from the mug. That's when the backstory of my family started replaying in my mind like an old, painful film. My earliest memories weren't of warmth, but of comparison. My sister always dressed in the prettiest clothes, praised for the smallest achievements. I, on the other hand, was told to work harder to be more like her. When she brought home a C, it was excused as a tough teacher. When I brought home a B, it was labeled laziness. I remember being 8 years old, overhearing my mother tell my aunt, "At least one of my girls will make us proud." That sentence never left me. It became the soundtrack of my childhood. Family dinners were supposed to be a place of connection, but for me, they were battlegrounds. If the roast chicken was too dry somehow, it was my fault. If my sister spilled her drink, I was scolded for distracting her. Small injustices piled up like bricks, building a wall between us that I could never climb. By high school, the pattern was impossible to ignore. My father took my sister to college visits while I filled out applications alone. She was gifted a car at 16. I worked 2 jobs to afford a second-hand one. Every birthday of hers was a grand event with balloons and neighbors and cake taller than my face. Mine. A small candle, a muttered happy birthday, and then silence. And yet through all of it, I kept trying. I thought if I studied harder, smiled, more stayed out of trouble, maybe they would see me. Maybe they would finally believe I belonged at that table. But recognition never came. I was invisible unless I was useful. Looking back, it's almost funny how desperately I chased crumbs of affection. It's painful to admit, but I shaped my entire identity around trying to please people who never wanted to be pleased by me. That's what makes betrayal from family so devastating. It's not just about what they do to you, it's about the years you spent bending yourself into knots for them. Have you ever lived that cycle? Have you ever felt like you could do everything right, and it would still never be enough? If you have, tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story, because nobody should carry that weight alone. The irony is, outsiders often envied my family. On the surface, we looked picture perfect. My parents were respected in the community, my sister adored by teachers and friends. People used to tell me, "You're lucky to have such a close-knit family." I would nod, smile, and swallow the truth that the house they envied felt like a cage to me. And here's the thing, when you grow up in an environment like that, you learn to doubt your own perception. You wonder, am I exaggerating? Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe it's me. That's how they control you, not with outright cruelty, but with subtle erasure. Until one day, like the night in that living room, the mask slips, and the truth is undeniable. That morning, sitting with my untouched coffee, I realized something important. My sister's words weren't an accident. They were the culmination of years of favoritism and dismissal. They had been saying it without saying it my whole life. That night, they just stopped pretending. I exhaled heavy and long, and for the first time, I stopped making excuses for them. Maybe they wanted a daughter who fit their mold better. Maybe they never intended to treat me as an equal. Either way, I couldn't change the past. What I could change was how I responded now. The backstory of my family wasn't a prologue anymore. It was evidence. Evidence that I had every right to step away, to stop begging for scraps of love, and to write a new chapter. And as I sipped my cold coffee, I whispered to myself, no more. I thought leaving that house would free me, but the truth followed me everywhere. The sense of being lesser, of being invisible, clung to me like smoke on my clothes. No matter how far I walked, the weight of my family's rejection stayed heavy on my shoulders. And the thing is, it wasn't just about that night. That night was only the breaking point of years upon years of quiet, persistent injustice. Growing up, I often felt like a guest in my own home. My sister's laughter filled the halls. Her trophies lined the shelves, her photographs decorated every room, and me. My presence was tolerated, not celebrated. When visitors came, my parents would beam as they talked about her grades, her charm, her bright future. If I spoke, I was interrupted. If I achieved something, it was brushed aside with a quick, "That's good, Claire." But did you hear what your sister did? It's hard to explain what that does to a person. You start to believe you are background noise in your own life. I remember one Christmas vividly. I had saved for months to buy my mother a necklace, something simple but meaningful. When she unwrapped it, she smiled politely, then set it aside to open the gift my sister had bought. It was a scarf, nothing special. But my mother's reaction, tears, hugs, praise felt like a spotlight shining on what I would never have. Moments like those stacked up over the years, tiny cuts that bled me dry. And it wasn't just my parents. My extended family played into it too. At gatherings, I was the one asked to fetch drinks, to clean up, to take photos. My sister was the one in the photos, the one toasted with cheers. Even neighbors noticed. "Your sister is so amazing," they'd say. "She's going places." And I'd smile, nod, and swallow the bitterness that burned my throat. But what hurt the most wasn't the favoritism itself. It was the way my feelings were dismissed every time I tried to voice them. If I ever said I felt left out, my father would sigh and tell me I was imagining things. My mother would shake her head and say, "Stop being dramatic." My sister would smirk and add, "You're just jealous." And the worst part. After hearing it enough times, I started to wonder if they were right. Do you know what it's like to question your own reality? To wonder if you're crazy for feeling pain that nobody else seems to see. That's what they did to me. That's the quiet cruelty of a family that denies your truth. They make you doubt your own mind. I carried that self-doubt into adulthood. At work, I hesitated to speak up in meetings. With friends, I downplayed my achievements. In relationships, I accepted less than I deserved because deep down I thought that was all I was worth. The shadow of my family's favoritism loomed over every corner of my life. And yet, despite all of this, a small part of me kept hoping. Hoping that maybe one day they'd realize how unfair it had been. Hoping that one day I'd walk into a room and feel wanted. That hope was both my lifeline and my curse. It kept me tied to them even when I should have cut the cord long ago. That's why my sister's words that night hit so hard. They weren't just rejection in the moment, they were confirmation of everything I had feared all along. They told me in no uncertain terms that I had never been part of their picture, that I had only ever been tolerated, never loved. And once the truth is spoken, you can't unhear it. I realized then that I had been living in a story where I was cast as the scapegoat, the overlooked one, the outsider. But if they wouldn't rewrite the script, I had to. Because the greatest injustice of all would be letting their version of me define who I really was. That night didn't just break me, it woke me up. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and unspoken war. I had chosen to distance myself, but families like mine never let you slip away quietly. They pulled you back, not with love, but with control, through guilt, through pressure, through manipulation, so subtle it could make you question whether walking away had been a mistake. It started with phone calls. My mother's voice was sharp, wrapped in false concern. "Claire, you're overreacting. Families fight all the time. Don't embarrass us by making this bigger than it is." My father chimed in too quieter, but firmer. "You should apologize to your sister. She was just stressed. You know she didn't mean it." Every word was like a hook trying to reel me back into the same trap. And then came the family dinner invitations, slipped into my mailbox as if nothing had happened. Sunday roast at 6. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just the assumption that I would show up, swallow the humiliation, and play my role as the quiet background character again. I refused. For the first time in my life, I said no. But saying no came with consequences. The whispers started. Relatives reached out, accusing me of being ungrateful. Neighbors avoided my eyes. My sister posted smiling photos with my parents online, captioned with phrases like, "Family is everything." Each one was a dagger meant to remind me that I wasn't included, that the picture was complete without me. The pressure mounted until one evening I sat in my car outside my apartment, staring at the steering wheel with my hands trembling. Part of me wanted to drive back to beg for scraps of acceptance to ease the loneliness pressing down on me. But another part, the part that had heard my sister's voice that night, cold and final, kept whispering, "If you go back, you'll lose yourself forever." I leaned back, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every time they had erased me, every moment they had denied my worth. If I gave in now, then all of that pain, all of those years of being treated as less would mean nothing. So I stood firm. And I'll ask you now, have you ever been in a moment like that? A moment where saying no felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. If you have, then you know the power of choosing yourself. And if you're listening to this right now, subscribe and stay with me, because together we'll never have to face that cliff alone. The rejection from my family only grew harsher. They stopped calling me by name, referring to me as she or that one. At gatherings I refused to attend, my empty chair became a symbol they twisted into pity. "Poor Claire," they would say, "she's lost her way." As if standing up for myself meant being lost. But every insult, every cold shoulder, every guilt-soaked phone call only added fuel to the fire inside me. For once I wasn't shrinking under their disapproval, I was growing stronger because of it. Their attempts to control me became proof that I was finally breaking free. Still, the loneliness was sharp. There were nights I cried into my pillow, wondering if freedom was worth this kind of isolation. But then I remembered that night in the living room, my sister's words like poison in the air. "You don't belong here." That sentence became my armor. If I didn't belong, then why should I beg to stay? It was during those nights that I began to write. Page after page, pouring out the memories, the pain, the rage. I didn't know it then, but I was building a record not just of what they had done, but of how I had survived it. Each word was a declaration: I exist, I matter, and I will not be erased. And though my family tried to silence me, my own voice was becoming louder. It's strange how the smallest details can cut the deepest. For me, the breaking point didn't come in a loud fight or a dramatic showdown. It came in moments so ordinary they should have been forgettable. And yet they burned themselves into my memory, each one a reminder of just how little I mattered to them. One Saturday, I stopped by my parents' house to pick up some boxes I had left in the garage. I told myself I was strong enough to walk in and out without feeling anything. But strength is fragile when you're stepping back into the place where your scars were born. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The walls were covered in framed photos, family vacations, birthdays, graduations. My sister was in almost every one of them, her smile wide, her arm wrapped around my parents. And me, I was there too, but only at the edges. Cropped out, blurred, half hidden in the background. In some photos, I wasn't there at all. My absence wasn't just accidental, it was deliberate. I stood there staring as years of dismissal stared back at me in glossy frames. My throat burned. I wanted to scream, to rip them all down, to demand why they never thought I deserved to be centered in a picture. But instead, I stood frozen, and in that silence, I realized the truth: they had been erasing me for years, and I hadn't even noticed. Another time at a holiday dinner, I remember watching as my sister dropped her fork onto the floor. Before I could even react, my mother turned to me and said, "Claire picked that up. Not to her, not to the one who dropped it me," like I was the servant at my own table. My cheeks burned, but I obeyed, because disobedience only brought more humiliation. I picked up the fork, placed it back on the table, and sat quietly, as if my pride hadn't just been stepped on. It's the little things like that which carve into your spirit. Not the big betrayals, but the everyday reminders that you are less valued, less loved, less human in their eyes. And the worst part is how normal it becomes. How you convince yourself it's not that bad, because at least they let you sit at the table. At least you're still in the room. But standing there in that hallway, staring at the wall of photographs, I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't really in the room. I was just tolerated. Have you ever noticed something so small, yet it shattered you? Something like being left out of a photo, being talked over in a conversation, being given the smallest slice of cake while someone else gets the biggest. Tell me if you've lived that kind of quiet dismissal. Your words matter here, even if they never mattered at home. That night back in my apartment, I pulled out an old shoebox where I had kept letters, ticket stubs, and little pieces of my life. As I looked through them, I realized none of those memories included my family. My happiest moments, the times I laughed until my stomach hurt, the days I felt proud of myself, they had nothing to do with them. It was a revelation, both painful and liberating. Because if the people who were supposed to love me most could erase me so easily, then maybe their approval was never worth chasing. Maybe the small, cruel details were not proof of my inadequacy, but proof of their inability to see me. And for the first time, instead of crying, I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I knew the truth now. Those details no longer controlled me. The photographs on their wall could tell whatever story they wanted. But my story, the real story, was mine to write. Humiliation has a way of lodging itself in your bones, but nothing compared to the moment they decided to make me a spectacle. It happened at a family gathering, one of those Sunday dinners that my parents prided themselves on. The table was long covered in dishes my mother had carefully prepared, the kind of setting that looked perfect from the outside. But perfection was always a mask in our house. I had already decided I wouldn't speak much that night. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I blended into the background, maybe I could survive the evening without incident. But predators always smell weakness, and my sister knew exactly where to strike. Halfway through dinner, my aunt asked her how work was going. My sister launched into a long story about her promotion, how her boss had praised her, how she was finally being recognized for her hard work. Everyone clapped, everyone smiled. I clapped too, even though my stomach twisted, because that's what I had been trained to do. Then my uncle turned to me. "And what about you, Claire? How's your job going?" It should have been a harmless question. But before I could answer, my sister leaned in with a smirk and said, "Oh, don't bother asking. She's still stuck in that dead-end position." Honestly, it's embarrassing. The table erupted in laughter. My parents didn't correct her. They didn't defend me. They laughed too. I sat there frozen, my face burning. My fork shook in my hand, the sound of it clinking against the plate louder than the laughter itself. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. Instead, I swallowed the shame and forced a smile so brittle it could have shattered. Do you know that feeling? That moment when the people who should protect you instead hand you over for ridicule? If you've lived it, you know it scars deeper than any physical wound. Tell me, have you ever been humiliated in front of everyone you love? Share it, because here your voice won't be silenced. As the laughter died down, I tried to change the subject. I mumbled something about a project I was working on, but nobody was listening. My words evaporated into the air. My sister's voice had drowned mine out completely. I excused myself from the table, walking slowly so they wouldn't see how badly I was shaking. In the bathroom, I gripped the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. My reflection stared back at me, pale and broken. For years I had endured the small dismissals, the subtle digs. But this was different. This was public execution carried out with a smile. I splashed water on my face, trying to steady my breath. And in that mirror, I whispered to myself, never again. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was a vow. When I returned to the table, they acted as if nothing had happened. Plates were being passed, wine-poured laughter bubbling as though my humiliation had been just another form of entertainment. I sat down silent, but inside me something had shifted. That night the humiliation no longer felt like weakness. It felt like fuel. Every cruel laugh, every dismissive glance, every time they looked through me instead of at me, they were all stacking up inside, building a fire that would one day burn its way out. And though I didn't know it then, that fire would lead me to a decision that would change everything. Ardos. I left that dinner with my head bowed, but my heart on fire. The laughter still echoed in my ears as I walked to my car, each step heavier than the last. But something inside me had shifted forever. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about how to win their approval. I was thinking about how to take back my dignity. The ride home was silent except for the sound of my own breath. I gripped the steering wheel until my fingers ached, trying to process what had just happened. My sister's smirk, my parents' laughter, the way no one came to my defense, it all replayed like a cruel film. But this time, instead of breaking me, it hardened me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew one thing. If they wanted me silent, I would make myself heard. If they wanted me small, I would take up space. They had spent years erasing me, but I had one thing: they couldn't take away my truth, and I was going to use it. The next morning, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not a diary, not a letter to them, but a manifesto to myself. I wrote about the photographs where I was cropped out, about the birthdays where my candle was the smallest, about the endless comparisons that left me gasping for acknowledgement. Line after line, the words poured out raw and relentless. It wasn't just writing, it was reclaiming. Each sentence was a declaration that I existed, that my story mattered. I didn't stop there. I started speaking up in places where I had always stayed quiet. At work, when a colleague tried to take credit for my idea, I called it out. In friendships, when someone dismissed my feelings, I told them exactly how I felt. The more I used my voice, the more I realized it had power. The world hadn't silenced me, I had been trained to silence myself. And I was done playing by those rules. One night, a few weeks after that dinner, my mother called again. Her tone was firm, as if she were delivering a verdict. "Claire, you need to apologize. You've embarrassed us long enough." For the first time, I didn't shrink. I didn't beg. I didn't let her words tie knots in my chest. Instead, I said, "No. I'm not apologizing. You should." The silence on the other end was deafening. For years I had longed for their approval, but in that moment I realized something shocking. I didn't need it anymore. And that realization, it was liberation. Have you ever stood up to someone who held power over you your whole life? The moment your voice finally rises, it shakes the walls. It terrifies them, but more importantly, it frees you. From that day forward, every interaction with my family was different. They tried the same old tactics: guilt, silence, dismissal, but they no longer landed the way they used to. Their words no longer pierced me. Their laughter no longer humiliated me. Because I had built armor out of my truth, and nothing could strip it away again. But here's what I didn't see coming. The more I spoke up, the more I threatened the story they had written for themselves. My resistance wasn't just defiance, it was exposure. And people who build their power on lies will do anything to protect those lies. That's when things started to escalate. The shift in me didn't go unnoticed. At first, my family acted confused, as if they couldn't believe I was suddenly standing tall. But confusion quickly turned to anger. They had built their kingdom on silence, and I was tearing down the walls brick by brick. The twist came on a cold Sunday afternoon when I received a letter in the mail, not an email, not a text, but a thick envelope sealed in my father's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, half expecting some token of reconciliation. Instead, I found words that made my blood run cold. They had decided to cut me out formally. The letter laid it all out in cruel detail, how my attitude had damaged the family's reputation, how my refusal to apologize left them with no choice but to distance themselves. And then the final blow, I was no longer considered part of the inheritance. My name was struck from every document, every plan, every promise I had once believed tied me to them. It was one thing to be laughed at. It was another to be erased in ink. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the letter, my chest tightening. For a moment I felt that old familiar ache, the voice whispering that maybe I really wasn't enough, that maybe this was proof I had never mattered. But then a stronger voice rose inside me. If they think money and papers define family, let them have it. I don't want to inherit chains. Still, the pain was real. Years of loyalty, of trying to please them, wiped out with a few strokes of a pen. It wasn't just about finances, it was the deliberate statement that I no longer existed in their world. That night I spread the letter out on the table and read it again under the harsh kitchen light. My hands trembled, but not with fear, with fury. They thought they could silence me with threats. They thought cutting me out would break me. But they didn't understand. All they had done was confirm what I had already begun to suspect. I never truly belonged to them, and now I didn't have to pretend anymore. Here's where the twist really landed. Losing their so-called inheritance freed me. For years I had felt tethered, like I couldn't fully walk away because of the strings they held. That envelope, cruel as it was, cut the final string. For the first time in my life, I was untethered. And though it hurt, though it burned, it was also exhilarating. I was no longer bound to play the role they had written for me. I could write my own. But don't think the story ends here, because what they didn't realize is that I had my own truth to reveal a truth that would shake their carefully curated image to its core. And once I let it out, there would be no going back. So stay with me, because if you think this was the final betrayal, you're wrong. The most devastating secret, the one that changed everything, was still waiting in the shadows. And I promise you will not believe what happened next. The letter was supposed to finish me, but instead it became the spark that lit a wildfire. I knew then that silence was no longer an option. If they wanted to erase me from their story, then I would write my own, and this time, the truth would be impossible to ignore. A week later, my sister hosted a dinner party at my parents' house. I hadn't planned on going, but something inside me said I needed to face them. Not to beg, not to plead, but to finally stand in my own power. So I walked into that house with my head high, clutching a folder under my arm. The room went quiet when I entered. My mother's lips tightened. My father's eyes narrowed, and my sister smirked as if I were a character in her play arriving on cue. Plates clattered, glasses shifted, but no one spoke. Finally, my sister broke the silence with a mocking laugh. "Look who decided to show up. Did you come to apologize?" I sat down slowly, placed the folder on the table, and met her gaze. My voice was calm, but every word was sharpened steel. No, I came to tell the truth. The folder contained years of receipts, emails, and records proof of how I had supported this family while being treated as nothing. Rent I had quietly paid when my sister couldn't make it. Bills I had covered when my parents were behind. The sacrifices I had made while they called me selfish. Every page was evidence undeniable and clear. I spread the papers across the table, watching as the color drained from their faces. My sister's smirk faltered, my father's jaw clenched, and my mother's hands trembled. For once, they couldn't laugh. They couldn't dismiss me. "Do you remember who helped you keep this house?" I asked, my voice rising. "Do you remember who stayed up nights working 2 jobs while you celebrated birthdays without me? Do you remember who carried the weight you pretended didn't exist? Because I do, and I'm done letting you erase it." The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of my sister scoffing. "So what, you think this makes you better than us? You think anyone cares about your pity party?" But her voice wavered, because she knew it wasn't about being better, it was about being seen. And here's where I'll turn to you. Have you ever had to lay bare the truth, not because you wanted revenge, but because you wanted freedom? Tell me, have you ever had to show proof of your worth to people who refuse to see it? Share your story, because your truth deserves to be heard. Back at the table, my father tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. My mother whispered something I couldn't hear. My sister pushed the papers aside, her face pale, her eyes darting like she was looking for an escape. For once, the power was mine. I stood, my chest rising with every breath, and said the words I had rehearsed in my mind for weeks. "You don't get to define me anymore. You don't get to silence me. From this moment on, I decide who I am." I walked out before they could respond, leaving the folder behind as a reminder. Let them sit with the truth they had buried. Let them feel the weight of the evidence they had ignored. Outside, the air was crisp, the night sky wide and endless. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Not because they had accepted me, they never would, but because I had accepted myself. And that night I realized something powerful. They could strip me from their inheritance, their photographs, their stories, but they could never strip me of my voice. What I didn't know was that my decision to stand tall would trigger consequences I never expected. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The silence after I walked out of that dining room was deafening, but it didn't last long. The backlash came faster than I could have imagined. By the next morning, my phone buzzed with messages that stacked up like bullets fired one after another. Some were from relatives. I barely spoke to others. From neighbors who had clearly heard my family's side before I could even share mine. "Claire, how could you embarrass your parents like that?" one text read. "You've always been jealous of your sister." "Grow up," another said. "And then the worst, you'll regret this. Family is everything. Family is everything." Those 3 words that had haunted me my whole life were now being used as a weapon, a chain meant to drag me back into submission. The phone calls were even more vicious. My aunt's voice shook with fury. "Do you know what you've done? You humiliated your parents in front of everyone? They can't even show their faces at church." My cousin laughed bitterly into the receiver. "Honestly, Claire, you just proved why nobody takes you seriously. Always the victim, right?" But what they didn't know, what they refused to admit, was that the truth I had laid out on that table couldn't be erased this time. My father tried to call, but when I answered, he didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "You've turned this family into a joke." His words hit me like a fist to the chest, but I stood my ground. "No," I told him. "I only revealed the joke you've been playing for years." He hung up without another word. The consequences spread like wildfire. My sister posted online painting herself as the victim. A perfectly curated photo of her hugging my parents, captioned with "Real family sticks together through anything." Within minutes, the comments flooded in. "You're so strong. Ignore the drama, you don't need negativity." They weren't just dismissing me, they were rewriting the story in real time, casting me as the villain. I wanted to scream, to shout the truth into every corner of the world. But instead, I sat in my small apartment, staring at my phone, realizing something crucial. They weren't shocked because I had lied. They were shocked because I had finally told the truth, and truth unsettles people who thrive in shadows. That week, I avoided the grocery store near my parents' neighborhood. I avoided the coffee shop where my sister liked to meet friends. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the weight of eyes on me, the whisper of voices trailing behind. It was as though my family had deputized the entire community to shame me back into silence. But here's what surprised me most. The shame didn't stick this time. Their words, their stares, Their attempts to isolate me, they hurt, yes, but they no longer controlled me. Every insult was proof that I had hit a nerve. Every cold shoulder reminded me that I had broken the mold they tried to trap me in. Still, the immediate aftermath was brutal. There were nights I curled up on the couch, tears streaming down my face, wondering if I could keep fighting. Nights when the loneliness pressed so heavy I could barely breathe. But each morning I woke up, made my coffee, and reminded myself they had already taken so much from me. I would not let them take my voice again. And if you've ever stood your ground and faced the storm that follows, then you know exactly how heavy that fight feels. It's exhausting, it's isolating, but it's also the truest test of who you are. The backlash was their attempt to bury me. What they didn't realize is that I had already started to grow roots, and soon those roots would break the surface in ways they never expected. Because while they were busy trying to shame me, I was preparing for something bigger. Something that would turn their entire world upside down. The smear campaign could have destroyed me if I let it. But the truth is, the more they tried to bury me, the more determined I became to rise. I realized I needed more than words. I needed action. A decisive step that would prove once and for all that I wasn't afraid of their whispers or their carefully constructed lies. So I made a decision that terrified me, but also felt inevitable. I contacted an attorney. Walking into that law office was like stepping into a new version of myself. My hands trembled as I explained everything, the years of financial support I had given them, the inheritance letter, the systematic humiliation. I laid it all out, half expecting the lawyer to dismiss me the way my family always had. But instead, he leaned back in his chair and said something that changed everything. Claire, what you've endured isn't just unfair. Some of it may be unlawful. For the first time, someone with authority validated my reality. It was like a weight slid off my chest. He explained how my contributions to the mortgage and bills could be documented, how evidence of financial manipulation and exclusion could hold legal consequences. He told me I had more power than I realized. When I left that office, I felt taller, stronger, no longer a scapegoat begging for scraps, but a woman with options and the courage to use them. Of course, when my family found out, chaos erupted. My mother called, her voice trembling with rage. How dare you drag strangers into our private matters? Family problems stay in the family. My sister sent a text dripping with venom. You're pathetic. Suing us won't make you part of this family. My father's voicemail was cold-controlled. If you do this, you'll regret it. But their fury didn't scare me anymore. It confirmed I was finally hitting them where it hurt. And I'll be honest, taking this step wasn't easy. I lay awake nights questioning myself, wondering if I was going too far, if I was becoming the very monster they painted me as. But every time doubt crept in, I pulled out the letter that cut me out of their inheritance. I read it slowly, carefully, reminding myself that they had already cast me aside. What I was doing wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. Have you ever stood on the edge of a choice that could change everything? That moment, where you know one step forward will ignite a fire you can't control. That's where I was, and if you've ever been there, you know the weight of that decision. You know how it feels to ask yourself, am I strong enough to see this through? Stay with me, because what came next proved that I was, and the fallout was far beyond anything I could have imagined. The case itself moved slowly, but the ripple effect was immediate. My family, once so confident, began to stumble. My sister deleted her posts about family unity. My parents stopped attending community events. The silence was louder than their threats had ever been. I could tell they were scared. Not of losing money, but of losing the image they had worked so hard to protect. And here's the truth I learned. People who build their lives on lies are always terrified of exposure. They'll do anything to keep the mask from slipping. But I had already ripped the mask off and there was no going back. The decisive step had been taken, the papers were filed, the evidence was in motion, and soon the secret they had guarded most carefully, the one that explained everything, would come crashing into the light. Filing those papers was like setting off an earthquake beneath my family's foundation. The aftershocks spread quickly, and I could feel the ground shifting under all of us. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the heavy calm before a storm. Within days, I noticed the change. My parents stopped answering my calls entirely, not that they had said much in weeks. My sister, however, doubled down. She blasted me on social media again, only this time her tone was sharper, almost desperate. "Imagine suing the people who raised you," she wrote beneath a smiling photo of her with my parents. The comments came flooding in. "Disgusting. Ungrateful brat. Family is forever." I used to read those words and feel crushed like a stone pressing against my chest. But this time I read them and felt strangely detached, as if the hate wasn't aimed at me, but at the caricature my sister had painted of me. They weren't attacking Claire, they were attacking the version of me she had invented, and that difference gave me strength. Still, the backlash had consequences. At work, a colleague pulled me aside and asked quietly, "Is everything okay? I saw some things online." My stomach twisted, but I met his eyes and said, "I'm fine. I just had to draw a line with my family." To my surprise, he nodded and said, "Good for you." That small validation coming from outside the chaos meant more than I could explain. The real fallout, though, was inside me. Nights stretched long, and I lay awake questioning myself. Was I destroying the last threads of connection I had to my family? Was I burning bridges I could never rebuild? But then I'd remember that letter, the smirk on my sister's face, the laughter at the dinner table, and the doubt would quiet down, because I knew the truth. They had burned the bridge long before I ever touched a match. Have you ever felt that conflict, knowing you're doing the right thing, but still grieving what you've lost? Tell me if you have. Share your thoughts, subscribe, and stay here with me, because this space is for people who've walked through fire and survived. You don't have to carry it alone. The days blurred into weeks, and the pressure mounted. I could feel the cracks forming in their perfect facade. My mother's friends stopped visiting as often. My father's voice, when he finally left me, a voicemail, sounded smaller, more fragile. And my sister, her posts grew erratic, bouncing between triumph and bitterness, like she was trying to convince herself as much as everyone else that she was still in control. The irony was that in trying so hard to destroy me, they were destroying themselves. The more they fought to keep their version of the story alive, the more obvious the cracks became. And deep down, I think they knew it. One night I sat on my balcony sipping tea as the city lights flickered around me. For the first time, I felt free. Not completely healed, not without pain, but free. Because I had chosen myself over their approval. I had chosen truth over silence. And that choice, no matter how lonely, was mine. But the earthquake wasn't finished. Beneath the rubble of their lies, something darker was stirring, a secret they had guarded for years. A secret that explained why they fought so hard to keep me quiet. And soon that secret would explode into the open. The storm with my family raged on, but something unexpected began to bloom in the cracks it left behind my own life. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, I wasn't living under their shadow. I wasn't waiting for their approval, chasing their scraps of affection, or tailoring myself to fit their expectations. I was free. And freedom, though terrifying at first, slowly started to feel like home. I poured my energy into rebuilding. It began with the small, ordinary routines that no one ever tells you are revolutionary. I woke up early, brewed my coffee, and sat with my journal, filling its pages with words that belonged only to me. I decorated my apartment with colors and photographs that reflected who I truly was. No more hiding at the edges of someone else's picture. These walls told my story now. Work became more than survival. It became purpose. With my voice finally unchained, I spoke up in meetings, pitched bold ideas, and took risks I had once been too afraid to try. My manager noticed. Soon I was leading projects, mentoring new hires, and hearing words I had never imagined directed at me. "Claire, you're a leader." For the first time, I believed it. Friendships deepened too. I let people see the real me, not the apologetic shadow I had been at family dinners. I laughed without worrying it was too loud. I shared my opinions without shrinking. And you know what people leaned in. They wanted more of me, not less. But the biggest change was internal. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped carrying guilt for things that weren't mine to carry. Slowly, the weight that had bent my shoulders for years began to lift. I started to walk straighter, breathe deeper, and see myself not as the scapegoat, but as a woman who had survived. Freedom, I realized, isn't just about walking away from chains. It's about learning to dance without them. Of course, there were moments when the loneliness crept back in, whispering that maybe I had made a mistake. On holidays, when I saw families gathered together, part of me ached. But then I reminded myself, belonging built on erasure isn't belonging at all. I would rather stand alone in truth than be embraced in a lie. And here's the lesson I carry with me, the one I hope you take too. Family isn't defined by blood, or last names, or legal documents. Family is the people who see you, who celebrate you, who stand beside you when the world turns cruel. Sometimes those people share your DNA. Sometimes they don't. And that's okay. So I began creating a chosen family. Friends who became sisters, mentors who became parents, communities who welcomed me not in spite of who I was, but because of it. For the first time, I felt what real belonging meant. Have you ever found that kind of freedom? Have you ever built something new after being broken? If you have, then you know the joy I'm describing. And if you haven't yet, stay with me. Subscribe, share your thoughts. Because together we'll remind each other that it's possible. Standing in my new life, I realized something else too. My family's attempt to erase me had backfired. By cutting me out, they had forced me to discover who I really was. By silencing me, they had taught me to roar. By rejecting me, they had freed me. And yet, even as I rebuilt, I knew the story wasn't over. Because buried beneath their anger and manipulation lay a secret one that had shaped every cruelty, every dismissal, every attempt to push me aside. That secret was about to come to light, and when it did, everything would change again. Freedom had given me strength, but the truth that surfaced next nearly stole my breath. The secret my family had buried for years, the one that explained why I was always treated like an intruder, finally clawed its way into the light. It came in the form of a dusty envelope tucked into a box of old papers I retrieved from my parents' attic. I wasn't searching for anything specific that day, just clearing out the last remnants of my childhood. But when I opened the envelope, I froze. Inside were adoption records, my adoption records. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling, my pulse pounding in my ears. Line after line confirmed what my heart had feared, but never dared to say aloud. I wasn't their biological daughter. They had taken me in, but never truly accepted me as their own. Every cold shoulder, every dismissal, every time I was told I didn't belong, it wasn't just cruelty. It was the truth they had been hiding. The weight of it hit me like a storm. All those years I had wondered why I was different, why I never measured up, why their love always felt conditional. The answer was right there in black and white. They hadn't wanted me to know. They hadn't wanted the world to know. And suddenly, everything made sense. I sank onto the floor, clutching the papers to my chest, tears streaming down my face. The betrayal was deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just favoritism. It wasn't just cruelty. It was the deliberate choice to keep me in the dark, to let me believe I was defective instead of telling me the truth. That night I confronted them. My mother's face went pale when she saw the documents. My father's lips pressed into a thin line. My sister crossed her arms, smirking as though she had always known. And maybe she had. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded, my voice breaking. Why did you let me grow up thinking I was less when the truth was sitting in a box this whole time? My mother's voice cracked as she whispered, "We thought it would protect you." My father's voice was harder. "You should be grateful we took you in at all." Grateful. That word sliced through me like glass. They wanted me to believe their cruelty was charity, their neglect was kindness, their erasure was a gift. But I wasn't that powerless child anymore. No, I said firmly, wiping my tears. You don't get to rewrite this. You don't get to call neglect love. You don't get to call lies protection. I deserved the truth. I deserved better. And for the first time, I saw something flicker in their eyes, not shame, not regret, but fear. Because the truth was out now, and once the truth is spoken, it can't be buried again. I walked out of that house carrying the documents, my steps steady even as my heart broke. I knew then that my past would never define me again. Their secret didn't diminish me, it liberated me. I wasn't broken, I wasn't unwanted. I was simply theirs by circumstance, not by love. And that was no longer my burden to carry. Standing outside the cold air filling my lungs, I felt something powerful closure. Not the kind that comes with reconciliation, but the kind that comes with reclaiming your own story. They had hidden the truth for years, but now it was mine to hold, mine to own, mine to use as the final chapter in their narrative of control. And here's what I'll say to you sometimes: the truth hurts more than the lie, but the truth also sets you free. 'Cause when you know who you are, no one can tell you otherwise. And if you want to hear what happened when I faced them one last time in court, when the truth became impossible for the whole world to ignore, click on the next video. You won't want to miss how it all unfolded. The storm has passed, but the echoes remain. When I look back now, I don't see only the pain, they will always be there, but I also see the growth that came out of it. Walking away from my family, learning the truth about who I am, and surviving the fire they set around me did not destroy me. It remade me. In the quiet of my own home, I built something different. I planted small pieces of joy like morning coffee on the balcony, late-night conversations with friends who feel like family, and laughter that doesn't come with conditions. These small rituals became the bricks of a new foundation, one I could finally call mine. The truth about my adoption, the favoritism, the rejection, yes, it hurt. But it also freed me from living in someone else's shadow. I am not defined by the family that tried to erase me. I am defined by the resilience I chose, by the voice I refused to silence, by the love I now give and receive freely. If there's anything my journey proves, it's this: family is not always the people you're born to. Sometimes family is the people you choose, the ones who choose you back without conditions. So here I stand, not broken, not erased, but whole. My story is not one of victimhood, it is one of freedom. And if you're listening now, feeling the weight of your own battles, know this: you have the power to walk away. You have the right to write your own story. The past is still there, but it no longer defines me. What defines me is the life I've built in its place. And that life rooted in truth, courage, and freedom is finally mine. What